Hello and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on the impacts of the Food Safety Modernization Act by Erin, Silva, and Don Stoeckel. This is your host, Alice Formiga, from the eOrganic Community of Practice at eExtension. You can find all eOrganic articles, videos, and our many upcoming and recorded webinars on organic farming and research topics on our website at the link on your screen. Before we get started, I'd like to just give you a very quick summary of today's program. The presentation will last about 45 minutes. We'll be reading the questions out loud after the presentation is over, at which time we'll have about 30 minutes for your questions. 2 weeks ago, we had another webinar on food safety with Chris Blanchard of Purple Pitchfork that covered practical measures that farmers can take to improve food safety. And that recording is now available on the eOrganic YouTube channel. This webinar will focus on the Food Safety Modernization Act. Today, we're very glad to welcome back Erin Silva of the University of Wisconsin. Erin is an assistant professor in the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Department of Plant Pathology, and she is the State Extension Specialist in Organic and Sustainable Cropping Systems. A major focus of her extension programming includes on-farm food safety for diversified vegetable farmers. Don Stoeckel is based in Columbus, Ohio, and he is the Regional Extension Associate for the Produce Safety Alliance in the Midwest. By training, he is an environmental and public health microbiologist, and he worked with the Cornell Good Agricultural Practices Group for nearly a decade on water quality issues related to food safety before joining the Produce Safety Alliance. For the past 5 years, he's been an instructor of Cornell's online GAPS food safety course. So with that, I'm going to hand over the presentation to our first speaker, Erin Silva.
Thank you, Alice, and good morning and afternoon, everyone. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Madison, and I know that everyone must be anxious to get out in the fields again, so perfect time to talk about food safety. And as Alice mentioned, I am thrilled that Don Stoeckel will be speaking with me. I know on some of the initial advertisements and publicity for the webinar, Don wasn't mentioned, but he has just a wealth of knowledge on this topic. So I'll be presenting some overview information first and then handing it over to Don to talk more about some of the water aspects and some other aspects with respect to implementation of FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act. So what is FSMA? FSMA has been, we've been hearing about FSMA for a bit of time now. FSMA is the first major overhaul to food safety laws since the 1930s. So it's been almost a century since the U.S. government really took up the issue of looking very broadly and extensively at the safety of our food supply within the U.S. So FSMA was first introduced into the House of Representatives as a bill on June 8th, 2009. So coming on 7 years now. That bill was then passed in the House in 2009, then went to the Senate, passed in the Senate in 2010, and then signed into law by the President in 2011. And really what this aims to do is to ensure a safe U.S. food supply by shifting focus from response, like we have been doing, to prevention. So instead of what we have seen with respect to food safety outbreaks or food contamination outbreaks, where we, through different epidemiological measures and looking at concentrations, I guess, of where people have been ill and then tracing that back to what sort of foods they've eaten, where that food was purchased or consumed, and then tracing it back to do these recalls, which is not necessarily the most effective measures, and it also can be very costly. Instead, looking at preventing those circumstances from even happening in the first place. So what this law does, it essentially gives authority to the Food and Drug Administration. So this is not administered directly by the USDA, although there certainly are partnerships between these two agencies to ensure that the measures are implemented effectively on the farms. But what it really does is give authority to the FDA to regulate the way foods are grown, harvested, and processed, including mandatory recall authority. So, as I mentioned, this was signed into law in 2010, and essentially the FDA has been writing the regulation to go along with the bill since that time. This has been a very thoughtful and extensive process. There have been multiple listening sessions throughout the country, opportunities for feedback from farmers and industry, and certainly the FDA took those comments seriously, and from the first release of the draft regulation to the final release, a lot of those thoughts and feedback were incorporated. So since that time, since the final rules were released this past November, as of January 26, 2016, the Food Safety Modernization Act is now in effect, and some of those timelines with respect to compliance are ticking. So with the implementation of the rule, now that it's in effect, we do have some compliance timelines. So all farms have at least 2 years to come into compliance, and smaller operations have as many as 3 to 4 years, and depending on the different aspects of the regulation, potentially even more time. And one of the things that I think I can safely say that both Dawn and I want to emphasize is that we don't mean that we don't intend for this presentation to be something where we're throwing at you a lot of regulation and making it a frightening and scary thing where people have to feel like they need to go out and start addressing all these aspects immediately. Certainly, like a lot of the aspects with different audit programs, there's different aspects that are more easily implementable, some that may be more of a challenge. We definitely want to inform people and get people to start thinking about how they will and how they'll also find out more information in terms of how to implement these various aspects of the regulation. But we really want to emphasize that this is a process. The FDA recognizes that this is a process and really want to keep people educated with respect to how things are moving forward. So with respect to timelines, the timelines are all based on gross annual produce sales, and these are based on a rolling 3-year average, so taken over the past 3 years. No more than, for very small businesses, those businesses selling no more than $250,000 worth of gross annual produce sales, they have 4 years to comply. For those that are considered small businesses, no more than $500,000, 3 years to comply, and those that are selling more than $500,000, they have 2 years to comply. And for these compliance deadlines, we are talking about produce sales. So overview of FSMA. FSMA is an extensive piece of regulation. So it really, again, is aiming to increase the safety of our food supply within the U.S. And there are several main pieces of the bill. What we are going to be focusing on within this presentation is the first part of the bill, the first title, which is preventing food safety problems and specifically those standards for produce safety. We will not be talking about the preventative controls for facilities, although that does fall under the same title of the bill, but instead really focusing on the produce safety aspect. It is an extensive piece of regulation, though, that does also include aspects with respect to importation of food, pet food, a lot of different aspects as it relates to the safety of our food supply. So the produce rule is impacting farms that grow, harvest, pack, and hold produce for human consumption. And what the produce rule outlines are new standards with respect to personnel qualifications and training, health and hygiene, agricultural water, biological soil amendments and manure, domesticated and wild animals, growing, harvesting, and packing, equipment, tools, and buildings, and there's more extensive regulation with respect to sprouts, and we won't be talking about sprouts today. Sprouts is really has some very specific aspects that if you are growing sprouts, I would encourage you to look more into what that will require with respect to compliance to FSMA. There are farms that are exempt from the regulation, and when we say exempt, we're talking about fully exempt, and those are not covered by the rules at all. Those are farms that are only growing produce that are considered rarely consumed raw. So some examples of that might be winter squash, pumpkins. There's a very specific list as to what the FDA is considering as produce rarely consumed raw. And it isn't necessarily intuitive. There are some items on that list where I certainly do consume those raw, and I think many people do. So again, this is an aspect where I would encourage you, if you do have a question, to look specifically at that list. Many of our organic farms here in Wisconsin are highly diversified, and there's fewer farms that are going to be only producing produce within that category. Most of those are going to also be producing produce that are considered as regularly consumed raw. Also, farms that are exempt are those that are only producing produce for personal or on-farm consumption. And then those farms that have annual gross produce sales of $25,000 or less, again, averaged over a 3-year period. This is a subset of that list of exempt produce. So again, you can see what the FDA are considering as produce that is rarely consumed raw. Again, some of these, you might consume some of these raw. I know some of our schools are slicing sweet potatoes and using raw sweet potato sticks as part of their snack program. So it's in those circumstances, there may be other nuances with respect to assessing risk, but according to the official regulation, this is the list that's considered as part of the exempt produce. Qualified exemption. So this is a second category, and this is produce that will receive commercial processing, for example, tomatoes for salsa, that will not be consumed raw. And it's also farms that fall under the Tester-Hagen Amendment for direct marketing. So what the Tester-Hagen Amendment aims to do is to have this be less of a burden for the farms that are smaller and selling more locally, selling into our local and regional food systems. So this includes farms that have an average annual gross sale of all food in a previous 3-year period less than $500,000 and sell 51% or more directly to a qualified end user. And that qualified end user can be for example, individuals, so direct to consumer, direct to a restaurant, or direct to a retail food establishment in the same state or reservation or within a 275-mile radius. They can do some wholesale, but they do need to fall within that metric of selling 51% or more to a direct qualified end user. There is some nuance to this, and it is important to note that when we are looking at the gross sales, when we're assessing whether a farm is under the qualified exempt category, it's important to note that this is taking into account all food sales. So this could also include grain, and that grain could either be for human consumption or livestock feed, because that's still considered a food. So again, this is something that causes a lot of confusion, something that people need to pay attention to, whether they're looking at whether their farm is falling under those various categories with relationship to compliance deadlines, or whether it's relating to whether or not they're falling under the qualified exemption. The other point that can be confusing is the fact that it's really looking at within the same state or within a 275-mile radius. So that's looking at, for instance, in Wisconsin, even though from Milwaukee to northern Wisconsin is going to be more than 275 miles, because it's sales within the same state, those would still fall under the qualified exemption category. But on the same token, a farm outside of Milwaukee could also be selling into Chicago, and still, even though it's outside of the state of Wisconsin, falling into the requirements of this Tester-Hagen Amendment. So it can be a bit confusing as to where people fall. It is important to note the point of the gross sales are considering all food sales, that there are certain points, again, thresholds with respect to how much produce is being sold, or how much food is being sold, excuse me, to a qualified end user versus to wholesale, and these geographic requirements. If you do meet those requirements, then instead of falling within the whole scope of the regulation, there is a modified set of requirements that you must adhere to. That includes keeping records and maintaining compliance, providing business information on a label or sign at the point of sale, and those farms are still subject to withdrawal in the reinstatement process if they are found to be out of compliance. So again, the qualified exempt farms are still subject to 3 parts of the regulation. General provisions, you must fit those definitions of what are your gross food sales over a 3-year period, the geographic regulations and geographic provisions, and then how much you are selling to a direct to consumer situation. Again, you are still required to be aligned with compliance and enforcement, and you are susceptible to withdrawal of the qualified exemption if you are found to be outside of compliance. So categories of fully covered farms, if you do fall outside of that Tester-Hagen amendment, whether or not you're selling outside of the same state, you're falling outside of a 275-mile radius, you're selling more than 51% of your produce to a wholesale situation, or if you're above that with respect to total food sales, then you're having to see where you're falling under these categories of fully covered farms. So this is again that nuance of changing the gross sales from food to produce. So very small businesses are those that are having less than $250,000 in average annual sales of produce. The second category is small businesses, and those are selling less than $500,000 in average annual sales of produce. And then there's essentially all other farms, so those that are beyond that $500,000 average annual sales of produce. And again, how does this then differ from a qualified exemption? Essentially, what we're looking at is when we're looking at those aspects, it has broader distribution, so it's considered higher risk because these farms are selling outside of what's considered a local or regional food system. And also the other point is, again, when looking at average sales, instead of looking at all food, we're looking at average annual sales of just produce. So depending on where you fall in these various categories, a very small business, a small business, or a larger farm, there's different timelines for coming into compliance. So out of these aspects, what will have the biggest impact on farmers? Many growers are probably already satisfying many aspects of the produce rule requirements. So again, the intention of this webinar is to not alarm people or frighten people that they're going to have to make wholesale changes to their farm within the next season, especially if farms are already doing aspects of either USDA or harmonized GAP, already develop some aspects of a produce or food safety plan. There may be already many aspects of the produce rule that farms are already satisfying. There are going to be some new training requirements, and I'll let Don talk about that because he's been very involved with those aspects as part of the Produce Safety Alliance. And over the next few years, farmers are going to be expected to attend specific classes, and classes that have specifically in curriculum that have been specifically vetted by the FDA. And certainly state departments of agriculture and state extension specialists will be looking at how to best make sure that those trainings become available broadly. There's a lot of nonprofit agencies that are also looking at how to ensure that those classes are available to farmers. So again, not something that we're pushing people to be doing within the next year, but instead educating people that keep an eye out for these trainings and see when they're located close to you and where the opportunities may be, because they will be required now with FSMA being implemented. There's also going to be more extensive water testing and record keeper requirements, and this could be some areas where there are the biggest impacts. Dawn will be talking about this in a minute, but again, there is even a more extended time period for compliance with respect to some of the water testing aspects, as well as the recognition that we do need some more specific data to go along with that. So more of an issue where we want to get people informed and we want to let people know what to look for, but also give people reassurance that there are some pretty extended compliance deadlines for some of these aspects. Sales records needed to justify your status, and this is an important point to note for even those farms that are then falling under the qualified exemption. It is important to even start now keeping some of those sales records, making sure that you are documenting that sales are going to qualified end users, the amount of sales that are going to various end users, and the type of produce that is being sold. So I would encourage people, if you aren't keeping those sales records already, that would be something this season to really look at developing different processes to ensure that those sales records are accurate and they're being maintained. Record requirements for many of the rule standards. I think for many of our organic farmers, this is probably going to be less burdensome and probably already a bit routine. And again, certainly as we look forward with respect to how to implement FSMA on the ground, we're looking at ways to align that record keeping with a lot of the organic record keeping so that it makes sense and that it's more meaningful to the farm so that there's not an additional burden to farmers with yet a second set of records. So like I mentioned, we do want people to realize that there are compliance timelines, that there's going to be time to phase in these various elements, but now is a good time to start thinking about or start seeking information on good systems to keep track of your records in the least burdensome way, and potentially, again, how that could align with some of the records that are already being kept for marketing purposes, for assessment of profitability, or for organic record keeping. Training requirements. There will be specific training requirements for farm employees and supervisors. At least one supervisor responsible party will need to take a food safety training course, at least the equivalent of an FDA-recognized standardized curriculum, and FDA is currently working with the Produce Safety Alliance to develop a standardized curriculum. However, farmers are not required to take the Produce Safety Alliance training course as long as the training that you do take covers FSMA requirements and is vetted by and approved by the FDA. And I know that there are groups that are looking at developing alternatives depending on specific nuances of the farm. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Dawn, who could also add a bit more about the status of where these trainings are, as well as introduce the Produce Safety Alliance and its role in those trainings, also Dawn's role within that organization.
Thanks a lot, Erin. I've been with the Produce Safety Alliance for about 6 months, and I wanted to thank Erin for inviting me to be part of this seminar. We were talking about some of the nuances of the rule, and she came to me because for 6 months this has been my professional life. I have been meeting with people, going through the rules, discovering how talented and driven the various people in this field are, whether they're growers, educators, or regulators, and just overall impressed by how everyone is trying to work together to meet the mutual goal of safe produce. The Produce Safety Alliance's role in this is education. We were set up as a cooperative agreement between Cornell, FDA, and USDA shortly after, while FSMA was under development, and we are serving a role to develop this 7-hour training course that Erin just mentioned is specified in the Produce Safety Rule. It's not the only alternative that you'll have, but it is the first alternative. I expect that will be the first training module to be approved for this purpose by FDA. Right now, we're anticipating that we will be starting in September after the growing season with some train the trainers, and the trainers that we'll be training include university extension people, inspectors, and also leaders in the industry, whether there's industry segments or some of the major buyers may also choose to be trainers of the supervisors or responsible parties. That's not, I just wanted to point out that it's not the only training that's required under the FSMA produce safety rule. That's one of 3 trainings. There are also required trainings for field workers, and there are required trainings for other workers on the farm. Those are less prescriptive. You'll find that there's a lot of flexibility that the authors of the rule wrote into the rule, and so they left a lot of flexibility in how you train your field handler, your field harvesters, and your other workers on the farm to meet the goal, to understand what they need to do to achieve produce safety. And those are written fairly clearly in the rule, but we'd be happy to take any questions on those. So with that, I'll start off by, I do want to acknowledge that we're headquartered in Geneva, New York. We're a very small group. Betsy Bin is our director, and we have 5 other trainers throughout the country, and I cover the Midwest, which is pretty, it's not especially well defined, but out of Ohio, I go to every state that I can drive to, and then if it's on this side of the Rocky Mountains, I pretty much try to help out in those states as well, aside from the Southwest and Southeast states that my colleagues cover. So that's forgive the long introduction, but I wanted to give you an idea of where we're coming from if you haven't heard about the Produce Safety Rule, or I'm sorry, the Produce Safety Alliance. So Erin talked about 2 main things that are going to be affecting, especially that will be especially important to small diversified organic growers, and those were water and record keeping. So we'll start with water, but I do want to get one thing on the table first, because I know that another part of the rule that's going to be very important to this group of growers, this segment of growers, is manure and compost. We did not include manure and compost in this seminar, partly because there's not much to say about manure and compost right now. FDA is taking between 5 and 10 years to develop the scientific basis upon which to build good, solid rules about especially raw manure, untreated soil amendments of biological origin. Biological soil amendments of animal origin. You have to get your words right. So they're developing the data upon which they can establish some appropriate regulations that will protect food safety. So we're not going to talk about manure and compost in the seminar. I'd be happy to talk about it in the question and answer session, but there's not a whole lot to say about it right now. What we do have things to say about are water and records, and since those are going to both be very impactful to all of you, I'll try to give some form to what the regulations say, and we won't go into details. Remember, we're developing a 7-hour course, and we're down to about 20 minutes that we want to finish this up within. So we'll try to give some form and make sure that you have some basis of what's going to be expected so that you can ask good questions and make good plans for your future. Water testing comes into 3 basic requirements, or categories. You've got harvest and post-harvest activities. That's your pack house water, your wash water, your equipment cleaning water, your hand washing water. You've got water used during growing of covered produce. There you've got irrigation water, and you've got sprays that contact produce. I think this is the only time we mention that the produce safety rule has a list of definitions, and there are some definitions that if you were to sit at a farmer's table and ask him, what do you mean by agricultural water, what the farmer might say might not be exactly the same as what is written into the produce safety rule. So it's very important to recognize the language that the regulators are using might not be the same as the language that you're using on the farm. In the case of agricultural water, we're only talking about the water that touches covered produce or is reasonably likely to touch covered produce. So drip irrigation on tomatoes or apples may not be considered agricultural water, but a frost protective spray or a foliar spray would be agricultural water. So not all the water on your farm is going to be considered agricultural water. And the basic rule of thumb is if it touches covered produce, it is agricultural water, or if it's reasonably likely to touch covered produce. Doesn't matter if it touches your pumpkins, but if it touches your yellow squash, it's important. For post-harvest water, we're going to start at the back end because it's a little bit simpler. In the packing house, there's a numeric criterion that says no detectable generic E. coli in 100 milliliters of water. That's really, really similar to the potable water microbial standard, which depending on, well, I think in April it changes to E. coli, but it's a no detective total coliforms traditionally in 100 milliliters of water. So this is a familiar test for many of you who have your drinking water tested. It's consistent with what we've been saying for GAPS for years, that it should be the microbial equivalent of drinking water. One difference in the produce safety rule is that if you have an untreated surface water source, even if it has no detectable E. coli per 100 mils, it cannot be used for harvest and post-harvest. There's also a qualitative standard. Safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, a little bit later. But I just want to make sure that everybody knows that you have to meet both the numeric criterion and the qualitative standard for harvest and post-harvest water. Irrigation water for pre-harvest, for growing water, it's a little bit more complicated. And I should have changed this to say not just irrigation water, but all water used. This is pre-gate water. This is water that's used on covered produce during growing activities. You have numeric criteria. The geometric mean is 126 or fewer generic E. coli, and the geometric mean just means the typical value, the value you're likely to find most often. There's a mathematical calculation, but what it means is this is the typical value. And then there's this, and this is an and. It's important to notice that this is an and, not an or. That the statistical threshold value has to be 410 or fewer. The 410 is a measure of the variability. It's the 90th percentile. Well, it's not really the 90th percentile. It represents, it's an estimate of what the 90th percentile would be expected to be if you were to collect 100 samples. So that's a variability measurement. So not only do you have to normally have low values, you can't have enormous spikes or you'll violate that 410. And why would you get enormous spikes? Because you've got poop coming into the river upstream from your irrigation takeout point that's sporadic. And so this is catching that sporadic source. Maybe there's a combined sewer overflow. Maybe there's runoff from from an animal operation that only comes in occasionally. This is protecting against those circumstances. That same qualitative standard applies for pre-harvest, for growing water, safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. One thing that I want to make sure that you know before anybody gets worried about this is that there's a lot of flexibility in the rule. There are corrective measures. So even if your geometric mean and statistical threshold value are above the numeric criteria, there are ways that you can manage your water and still use it with within the guidelines of the produce safety rule. And this is a good time to mention, I meant to say this at the very beginning of this conversation, that the produce safety rule is intended to be a minimum expectation. Simply following the line and verse of the produce safety rule may not be enough to deliver safe produce in all cases. Following the line and verse of the produce safety rule does not get you off the hook of thinking about produce safety on your farm. So, well, we can talk more about that in question and answer if anybody wants to follow up on that. So, here's our Hitchhiker's Guide Don't Panic moment. If you're worried about geometric means and statistical threshold values and saying this is another example of a person in an office making me do things that I'm not equipped to do because I don't know how to calculate those things, and believe me, it takes all of us some time to figure out how to calculate those. There are calculators that are available to do that math for you. This is one that I made, just an example screenshot of 20 samples, and it just plunks out the GM and the STV value for you. There's an Excel spreadsheet that Western Center for Food Safety has developed with FDA, and you can also use that, or a similar one from Arizona. I want to get through what these profiles mean. What's the overall, what's the big picture? For water used during growing activities, you're going to, if it's a surface water source, you're going to start by collecting at least 20 samples over the course of 2 to 4 years, no less than 2, no more than 4 years. That gives you a long-term idea of what the water quality of your source is. Based on those numbers, those 20 values, you are going to calculate, or you're going to use a calculator to calculate the GM and the STV. We'll talk about what you do with those numbers when we get to the right side of this figure. Every year after your initial profile is developed, you're going to collect 5 more samples for analysis. You're going to add those to the 3 prior years, and you'll have a 4-year rolling data set that depicts what has the water quality of your source been like for the past 4 years. If your water changes, if you have to do this for every water source, so if you have a different water source, you have to do another water quality profile. Or if there's been a big change upstream from your water, or from your farm, you have to restart and reestablish that initial water quality profile. So remember, the values that you're looking for, the numeric criteria, the 126 geometric mean and the 410 STV. If your values are higher than that, you don't have to do anything that day. It's as soon as practicable and no later than the following year. This is a long-term management strategy. You need to either stop using that water, go to a different source, apply it in a different way is another option. If you can convert it from agricultural water to not agricultural water, for instance, by using drip irrigation, you can do that. But if you want to keep using it in the way that you have been using it, there are 3 corrective measures. And I'm going to go to them, and those are a time interval to allow die-off, reinspection and fixing it, or treating it. I'm going to briefly talk about groundwater because it's the same structure. The difference is that because groundwater is less susceptible to contamination, you're taking fewer samples over less time, and then the annual sample is less too. So instead of a 20 sample data set for groundwater, you're only talking about a 4 sample data set. What do you do about it if you do not meet those criteria? You're allowed to have a 0.5 log per day die-off in field. So basically, after you irrigate, 68% of the generic E. coli are expected to die off every day because they're being burned by the sun, they're drying out, the temperature is high. So that means, to do the simple math, after 2 days you get 1 log die-off. 1 log die-off is 90%. So if your geometric mean, instead of being 126, is 1,000 CFU per 100 milliliters, 1,000 is a little bit more than 10 times as much, you could apply a 2-day time interval between application and harvest. That would get you to a calculated geometric mean of 100 instead of 1,000, and you would then meet the criteria. The option that I prefer and that I try to push is to find out what the problem, instead of taking care of the problem, find out what the problem was and fix it. Reinspect, identify the problems, and fix them. And that's the reason why I say it's the preferred choice for me from a produce safety standpoint. I would rather not rely on in-field die-off. I would rather fix the problem and start with clean water. You can also treat the water under the rule, but at this time, at the time of publication, which was November 2015, FDA stated that there is no product that is currently labeled to treat irrigation water. And as you know, it's a violation of law to use a pesticide or chemical in a way that's off-label. Although I'm not a huge fan of the die-off option, it is very much the low impact option. So I think a lot of people will use the die-off option. There's a time limit. You're only allowed to apply it for 4 days. So basically you get a 99% credit maximum, 2 logs maximum for die-off. If you use the 1/2 log per day option, you don't have to validate that that was effective on your farm. That's a standard. That's an expectation that according to the rule, you don't have to validate. You can use it without validation. You do have to keep records of your calculation and the number of days. So you have to write down in your records, when did you apply water? When did you harvest? Make sure that you have the appropriate number of days in between and have the calculations to back up that you know that you needed 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, or 4 day application interval, or I'm sorry, time interval between application and harvest. If you know that in your area, if you're in the Sonora Desert and you know that they die off faster, well, if you have data to support a 0.75 log per day or a 1 log per day die off, you can rock on and do it so long as you have the data to support your alternative rate. You can also, and this is a case that this is something that is happening in Idaho, Oregon with onions. I'm spacing on the particular type of onions, but yellow onions. Someone has gone through and estimated what is the die-off after the onions have been harvested during the extended storage period, so that they can calculate the storage credit, the die-off during storage that they can expect on onions, and that affects whether they can use a particular source of water or not. So it does seem a little bit complicated. You do have 2 additional years. After your compliance date, you have 2 more years to build your water quality profile. Remember, for surface water, you need a 2 to 4 year water quality profile. So you do have 2 more years beyond your compliance date. You probably all have an idea in your heads of what your compliance date is, depending on whether you are small, very small, or other, whether you're qualified exempt. It means that all farms have at least 4 years, and during that time frame, there may be some more research to support the alternative standards and testing frequencies and die-off rates that I alluded to in the Oregon and Idaho's onion question. Many of you, I expect, are going to be qualified exempt just from the general description that I got of who is tuning in. And I think that this is a great time to point out that not only is the produce safety rule a minimum expectation for what you'll do to protect produce safety, but that the produce safety rule isn't your only pressure. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but you know that your buyers are going to be concerned about the safety of the produce, and they may request that you use this as the as your benchmark for produce safety, and affect your decisions on how to operate in the context of the produce safety rule. I want to talk just one moment about compliance because there are a couple of questions. There's a lot of flexibility in the rule, and I want to make sure that you know that this year, 2016, you may not be able to start building your water quality profile. I think it's a great idea for you to know the quality of your water so you know what to look forward to, but in terms of building a water quality profile, there is a specific method that has to be used. There's some flexibility as to where you sample so that it's a representative water source. There's some flexibility in, well, or maybe it's more prescriptive when you should sample, some uncertainty about whether you should be sampling during use of the water or as close as practicable to harvest. If you have questions on these topics, I would encourage you to write them into the Technical Assistance Network so that FDA knows that people have questions about those topics. I'm going to try to take, and I hope you don't, I hope Alice, if you don't want me to take 5 minutes to cover the topics that we have remaining, please speak up. The rest of the topics deal with labels. If the produce requires a food packaging label, it has to be prominently displayed, and your compliance date is January 1st, not January 26th. I had to look this up. January 1st of 2020. If your food does not require a food packaging label, then you have, and I think Erin brought this up earlier, you have to include information about the origin of that food prominently and conspicuously at your sales site contemporaneously at the same time as you're doing the business. So if you have a if you have a stand, or if you're at a if you are at an auction, or if you're at a farmer's market, you have to write down where did that produce come from. For internet sales, it can be an electronic notice, and then the definition of a complete business address is given in the rule as street address, P.O. box, city, state, and zip. The timeline for providing that labeling information, not the actual food packaging label, but the label on your farm stand, are January 26, 2020 for that would be very small businesses, or 2019 for small businesses. We talked a little bit about sales records when Erin introduced the topic. If you are going to be qualified exempt, and many of you will be, you have to keep dated sales records. You don't have to, and you don't have to sign them. Most records have to be signed, but you have to have dated sales records so that we know which year did the inspectors know on which year did you sell that produce. You also have to do an annual review of the sales records to confirm what your expectation is whether you're less than the 25,000 or whether you are in the qualified exempt categories of produce sales to qualified end users. That should start this year. They don't have to be submitted to FDA, but they should be retained and made available on request. The records, not just those sales records, but all records that you keep under the produce safety rule have to be detailed. So for instance, those sales records have to be detailed enough that you know whether you were selling to someone within a 275-mile radius, accurate enough to read. Accurate in their quantities and legible enough to read, excuse me. And most records have to be dated and signed or initialed, but those sales receipts have got a special exemption that they don't have to be signed or initialed. All records have to be can be stored out. No, they should be available. They can be stored off-site if you can get to them within 24 hours. It's okay for them to be written or electronic. One of the most important things for y'all, especially if you're going through organic certification and you're already keeping a lot of records, you don't have to duplicate records. You can use those records for both purposes. Compliance and enforcement. Qualified exempt forms are subject to the same compliance and enforcement provisions as covered farms. What I think the most important thing to note is that regardless of whether you're color covered or qualified exempt, it is a prohibited act to put adulterated food into interstate commerce. The produce safety rule is one way to help you to know whether or not your food is adulterated, but whether you're covered by the produce safety rule or not, you can't put adulterated food into interstate commerce by law. FDA can withdraw your qualified exemption if there's an active investigation of a foodborne illness outbreak that was linked to your farm, or if they think it's a good idea to. So the take-home messages that we wanted to get across to you is that, and you'll notice that we did not give you much information about enforcement and inspections. The reason is that the inspectors haven't been trained yet. The grants that the federal government is offering to the states to initiate inspection and enforcement are still being written. The bottom line is we still don't know exactly how inspection and enforcement are going to happen. It's on the ground. We can give you some principles for how to meet the intent of the rule, but we don't know the details of how inspection and enforcement is going to happen. Your state's Department of Ag are valuable sources of further information and training. You've got extension, nonprofit organizations, the alliances, including Produce Safety, which is my organization for the Produce Safety Rule. Sprout Safety Alliance deals with specific issues dealing with sprouts under the Produce Safety Rule. And mea culpa, I did not put in the Preventive Controls, FSPCA, Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, the FSPCA, which covers a whole different, well, not a whole different topic, but a tangential topic, which is the pack houses that are required to register as facilities. Those are covered under the Preventive Controls for Human Foods Rule. With that, I will turn it back over to Alice. I want to thank you all for your attention and for allowing me to take these few moments to talk with you about the produce safety rule.
Thank you very much, Don and Erin. So with that, I'll move on to the questions. There are a number of questions that address exemptions, and there's all kinds of interesting types of farms among audience members here, so I'm just going to go through them here. Is compliance necessary for food bank gardens where all the food is given away? Certainly we will want food to be safe, but some things are more difficult.
We have had some discussions about that, and the language of the rule as it is says that the value of the food sold has to be $25,000 or more. We interpret that to mean that food banks and others who give away the food are not covered. I wouldn't want to stand up in court because I don't have the expertise or the authority to do so, but my interpretation of the rules is only the produce sold.
Okay. On this farm, they say, our farm contracts the majority of its produce through large companies such as Bolthouse. Does this count as an exemption?
I'm not sure what a Bolthouse is. I'm sorry,
Okay.
I have to confess my ignorance.
If the questioner wouldn't mind just clarifying what the process there is and just typing that in, then we'll have a better idea of exactly what you mean by that question.
Erin, do you know?
Well, Bolthouse is a large carrot packer. I think that's all they do is carrots. So whether or not the farmer is contracting with a larger, it's not processed carrots per se, and they're still eaten fresh, but they're not. Then Bolthouse is then distributing it to a national market.
Okay. Does Bolthouse sell direct to consumer?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah. So if they don't sell direct to consumer, then they would not be a qualified end user.
Okay.
Is that consistent with what you understand, Erin?
Yeah. Unless there's a specific circumstance here, that would be my understanding.
Yeah, someone just typed in that they also do vegetable juices. Okay.
So that, but I assume that it would be pasteurized juices. Right. That's one of there's so many nuances, so I'm always asking Don to help me interpret the various nuances.
You're right. If there's a kill step, then that would be exempt also.
Yeah.
Okay, what about this one? Would a farm that operates a local CSA, sells at farmers markets and sells to restaurants within a 275-mile radius and makes less than $500,000 in the previous years of sale be totally exempt?
It would still fall under the qualified exempt, or under 25,000?
They said under 500,000, so I agree with you, Erin.
Yeah, they'd still fall under the qualified exempt.
Okay.
They're not totally exempt.
Yep. Okay, and let's see. And this person is selling more than 51% of the produce to a mobile farmer's market. In other words, is the mobile market a retail food establishment? So the specific language about what is a retail food establishment, I've looked up numerous times because it's good to know exactly. And of course, it was written before mobile farmers markets probably existed. But my interpretation of that language is that anything that is direct sale to consumers, whether it's restaurants, grocery stores, farmers markets, or mobile farmers markets, would be qualified end users. Okay, so here's the last one here like that. Well, no, it's not the last one, but this one is a farm stand located on the farm. So that would also be a retail food establishment. Yeah, yeah, I think so.
The one question I've gotten there that may be related is that still requires, and Don, you might be able to clarify this, that still requires some sort of signage, and some of the farmers that I've been working with want to know what sort of signage does satisfy the qualified exemption when it comes to a farm stand that's on the farm.
Yep. Yeah, we had a question about that actually. So,
okay.
It's a question that I get fairly frequently. So, Don, I don't know if you have any insight in terms of how to suggest the labeling occur at an on-site farm stand, if the sales are actually on the farm itself, if that is enough, or whether it requires some other sort of signage.
I think a related question is if you are selling produce from your farm and also an adjoining farm or from another source, do you have to label each one of those individually as to its source of origin? And I don't know the answer to either of those questions. I think those would be questions for the TAN, but also maybe those are things that would be in the guidance that the inspectors will be trained on, but have not yet been trained on. Do you have clarity on that second question, Erin?
I would imagine that if it was sales that were also coming from a different farm, that would require some sort of specific labeling to clarify the origin of the produce. But I too am not clear in terms of if the produce is actually sold on the farm and the customer knows it because they're physically present exactly where the produce is actually grown, whether or not another label or sign on the farm stand that also gives the physical address and a name of the farm is necessary. That's again one of those nuances that I'm not sure if we have a clear answer to at this point.
But it seems worth pointing out or reiterating at this point that the compliance dates for those provisions are 2019 or 2020, so there is time. You're not going to get busted this year.
Okay. Okay, here we have someone asking about wild-crafted foods such as fiddleheads and mushrooms that are sent out of state. It's basically everything covered under this act other than that list that Erin showed us?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question.
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's a season where we're going to start harvesting ramps, and how do you then have different agricultural records and where those, and this is too where there's a very specific list as to what the FDA is considering rarely consumed raw, but there may be specialty produce that is not included there, and unfortunately at this point my understanding is we still have to take exactly the FDA guideline, even though there are some circumstances that deviate from that. But in terms of wild harvested mushrooms or ramps or fiddleheads, I'm not sure where those would, because they're a little bit apart too from an agricultural production setting, but yet they're still entering our food system.
Okay, from the next person we have a comment first and then a question. The comment is that it might be good to just clarify that the FSMA is a major update to fresh produce food safety, but not all food safety. For example, dairy production and processing already has had stringent regulations.
That's an excellent point.
And then the question is, are the forthcoming rules on manure and compost also going to address using draft animals in vegetable production? Do you have any idea about that?
I don't know that there's going to be anything new about draft animals. There are provisions about working animals, including draft animals, which uses language such as if you know or have reason to believe that the manure or the excreta from that animal has contaminated produce, you have to take reasonable measures to not harvest that produce and have it enter the food chain, the human consumption food chain. There, you'll notice there's a lot of flexibility in that, but I don't know that there's going to be much more written about draft animals.
Okay, I think you mentioned this already, but this person says she is also the organics coordinator, and so can I use those records if requested?
Erin, correct me if I'm wrong here. My understanding is that if you have organics records and produce safety rule records that cover the same topics, you can use them interchangeably.
Exactly. I mean, certainly if the way that you're collecting those records for organic certification also have the same information that is required from the FSMA regulation, you don't have to physically keep two different sets of regulations. But I would caution that particularly to be sure that you have the appropriate records for qualified exemption. There may be some new modifications that you might make, which may not necessarily be burdensome, but as Don had mentioned, some specifics with dates, or just make sure that when you're keeping those records for organic that it does include all the information. And it may just be altering forms or having a column for that additional piece of information, but certainly keeping two physical sets of records I don't think is an expectation.
Okay, the next few questions are about water. This one is asking, if I use potable city water, will I still have to test it?
Thank goodness. Here's a nice yes or no question, which is rare with water. You are using water from a public water supply, such as your city water. You should, well, actually, you must collect from the utility or the treatment from the provider. They'll have a certificate of compliance or some other form that says that they tested the water at least once that year and that it was confirmed to be no detect. In this case, it'll probably be total coliforms. But since E. coli is a total coliform, if there's no detect on total coliforms, there is also no detect on E. coli. So you just have to keep those records.
Okay. All right. This person says, so we're not exempt, and to meet the deadline for water quality testing, that seems to require that we take 5 samples of our river this year. But do I understand correctly that these samples won't be meaningful until those sampling and testing guidelines come out?
This is a little bit delicate, but I guess what I would like to say is that you cannot sample this year with confidence that you're sampling right and that your data will be usable in the future. You do have, because the requirement is over 2 to 4 years, you can start in what year are we in? 2018. You can start in 2018 and sample 10 samples a year for 2 years. So you do have some wiggle room. I know that some people would like to start sampling this year. If you do start sampling this year, I would recommend that you make sure that your lab is using modified MTEC and not COLALERT, because at this time, COLALERT is not approved as equivalent.
Okay. Let's see. This person needs some clarity on the definitions of produce water, surface water. In other words, does the surface water include rainwater catchments or wells?
If the water comes into contact with the environment, it is considered surface water. And I'm paraphrasing from a very precise definition that's in the produce safety rule in section subpart A. Actually, maybe I have it open in front of me, so maybe I should just go ahead and read it to you. Surface water means all water open to the atmosphere, rivers, lakes, reservoirs, streams, impoundments, seas, estuaries, and all springs, wells, or other collectors that are directly influenced by surface water. This is another area where we're not quite sure what is meant, every aspect of what is meant by directly influenced by surface water. The point being that the rules authors seem to be erring on the side of being safe, and if a spring comes out into a spring pool, it would be considered surface water. If a well has a cracked casement and you know that runoff water is trickling into the well, it would be considered surface water. And I hope that answers the question.
Okay, there's another question about surface water. Do I send a surface water sample from a pond and a packing house sample, which is well water, to the same lab, like my county public health department? Can you please clarify the method for testing surface water, and how many days does it take, I mean, it's a lot of questions here, from when you take the sample and when you find out the E. coli count?
Okay, I'll try not to bore you because there are a lot of nuances in this. Right now, all water samples have to be measured, have to be analyzed by US EPA method 1603, which is modified MTEC. It's a membrane filtration method, or an equivalent method in what are the words? Sensitivity, accuracy, and precision. So what is important to this questioner is that your county lab, your county health lab probably focuses on potable water. Labs that focus on potable water, drinking water, tend to use the COLALERT method, which is a very simple and cheap presence-absence method. Right now, COLALERT is not accepted. You can also do COLALERT in a quantitative mode that a lot of the public health labs wouldn't do. So what you need to know is that right now, the one method that the keyword that you should be asking about is modified MTEC. It's a quantitative method. It's for both surface water and groundwater. It's for both post-harvest water and growing water. And some of the limitations of modified MTEC are that you have to, well, one key limitation is that you have to hold the sample on ice for no more than 8 hours before analysis. And this also differs from potable water tests, which often allow room temperature for 30 hours. So overnight shipping is not currently an accepted practice. You have to hand deliver that sample on wet ice to the laboratory within 6 hours so that they can analyze it within 8 hours. And that's why I said there's some uncertainty. I don't think that those are going to stand, but I do know that we haven't been able to get affirmation that alternatives are currently accepted.
Okay. Let's see. The next couple of questions deal with some different issues. For example, besides sales records and water test records, what other kinds of records are going to be required?
Erin, do you want to take this or do you want me to?
If you would, that would be great.
Awesome. I knew I should have brought some water. So you've got your water test records. I cannot give you a comprehensive list because there are just a lot of things. You're going to have your sales records. You're going to have the samples of water tests. If you treat your water, for instance, if you add sanitizer in your packing house, you have to be using a method that is known to bring the E. coli down to no detect. So you have to keep records of how you monitored your treatment process. For instance, your bleach concentration and pH, or your sanidate or tsunami concentration, or your ORP. You have to keep those records so that you know that the pack house water was consistently safe and of adequate quality for its intended use. If you're making your own compost, there are some pretty clear guidelines about what are accepted methods for making compost. So you have to log your temperature, your turnings, things along those lines. You have to do an annual inspection of your water system, which includes looking at both the water source and the water distribution system, keeping the water source free from trash. So you have to record your observations during that observation, during that inspection of your water system. If you things like how often did you change the toilet paper and clean out your toilets? Do you have a map of your farm that shows where the toilets are relative to the working area so that you know that you have the toilets within 1/4 miles or 5 minutes walk? Other things that you do, corrective actions that you take to protect produce safety. Did you inspect the fields for deer feces before harvest? And if you found deer feces, did you mark off that area and not harvest that produce? Those are the ones I can come up with off the top of my head. It's not a comprehensive list, but it gives you a flavor of the types of things that you need to keep records on.
I don't think my impression is that it most likely is not going to differ significantly from the types of records beyond the water component, which again we're still kind of getting some clarity on from the sorts of records kept in like a harmonized gap type audit. So I think again those farmers that are already engaging in those sorts of third-party food safety audits will be fairly close to coming into, easily coming into compliance. So if you're familiar with the sorts of records that are required through a third-party food safety audit, especially a GAP type audit, a USDA or harmonized GAP audit, those are the sorts of records that are needed.
And thank you, Erin, for walking us back from the cliff. I didn't have much of scary things. I do want to share that I've spoken with numerous third-party auditors, and every one of them says that the third-party audit process and documentation is as intense or more intense in terms of what you need to do. That if you're already meeting third-party audit requirements, you are already meeting most of the produce safety rule requirements.
Okay, I'm not sure if the rule directly addresses this, but if it does, how long can you keep squash in storage, or how soon do I have to use it, and do you need to post that type of information?
That is not part of the produce safety rule.
All right. Yeah, okay. Let's see. What might it cost to get 20 surface water samples tested?
Generally costs about $50 a sample. Some can get it for as little. I've seen people say that they get it for as little as $25-$30 a sample. I've seen people say they spend $60 to $70 or $80. Sometimes that's when the person comes out to collect the sample for them. But the rule of thumb is something less than about $50 a sample, so $250 a year.
All right, we have time for one final question, and that is, do other parts of the FSMA address the rest of the food chain?
I guess from where I mentioned that it's broader versus the produce rule that we were addressing, there are other aspects that relate to the importation of produce, relate to packing facilities, and relate to other aspects of produce. So certainly the produce rule, what we focused on today, depending on the scope of the farm and whether or not they're doing any sort of repacking, there's other aspects that farms may have to be aware of. But Dawn, and if you can talk more about the breadth of the produce or the FSMA rule beyond the produce rule, the first aspect that we talked about today.
Yeah, the scope of the FSMA does cover a lot of aspects of the food chain, including, as you mentioned, the foreign supplier verification program. There's the transportation rule. There's the preventive controls for human foods, which covers canning and so on. There's the preventive controls for animal food. There are 3 others that the names of. There's third party auditing rule. So there, it does cover other aspects. Not as familiar with those as the produce safety rule, obviously, but yes, this is not the only sector that is being regulated. It's a top to bottom, farm to fork intent of scope.
Okay, well, we're running out of time now, but I'd like to thank everyone for all those questions. So thank you so much, Erin and Dawn, for all the information in your presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining us.